Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I'm doing a book review on Rise of the Necrofauna by Britt Ray with a foreword by George Church. I have switched up my background because this book talks about extinct species and endangered species and two specific species, woolly mammoths and passenger pigeons, that have gone extinct and that there are invested efforts to bring back. So before I go too much farther, yes, I'm 27 and I loved my stuffed animals. Still do, always will. This is Euphrates. I got him for my birthday one year. Must have been 17 because we went on a road trip and I found him in Kentucky, which was the first place we went to. And so he sat in the middle seat all the way up through Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and back to Colorado, which for those of you not from the States it's a long road trip. It took us 3 weeks with stops. But yeah, this is Euphrates. Tigers are definitely endangered. And then this is Tika Babar, because my dad named her Babar and I named her Tika, and because dad refuses to acknowledge her as anything other than Babar, it's just become her second name. Elephants are also endangered, both Asian and African elephants, because they are hunted for their ivory, as are rhinoceroses, which she also discusses the whole extinction, basically, of northern white rhinoceroses in Kenya towards the end of the book. So I wanted to do this here so that, I mean, they're not realistic necessarily, but with a more appropriate background, I felt. Also, Tika is just really soft. Now that the formalities are out of the way, let's talk about the book. This is a nonfiction about, well, like it says on the title, the science, the ethics, and the risks of de-extinction. De-extinction, as Britt Ray puts it, is bringing back some form of an animal that's gone extinct. For example, like I mentioned before, woolly mammoths and passenger pigeons. Woolly mammoths obviously went extinct a long time ago. I think she said about 66,000 years ago. That sounds right. The last ice age, basically, they all died. And passenger pigeons went extinct in 1914, which doesn't actually sound that long ago, specifically because it's 100, well, mathematically it's about 106 years ago. But I believe Martha, the last passenger pigeon, died in September, if I remember correctly, so it wouldn't quite be 106 yet. Maths aside, she goes through all of it. She starts out by explaining the science behind it, and that there are stem cells, germ cells, and another type of cell that I can't recall, and explains all of the science in a very bite-sized, manageable, non-scientific-y person way, which I greatly appreciated because I'm not a science person. I did well in my biology, earth science, physics classes, but I mean, they were high school level and I never really cared enough to get deeper into them. So this is definitely a book that you can read if you only have a high school level biology course. She explains everything you need to know in the beginning, in the first chapter or so that you understand what they're doing when she talks about cloning, or she doesn't use the word splicing, but that's what it sounds like, splicing genes into each other. Or she talks about IVF, she talks about surrogacy, all that kind of stuff. It was really fascinating to read how people have been going about this and how long it's actually been thought of. Obviously, there's Jurassic Park, and she does mention that throughout the book, because one of the scientists whose idea it first was back in the 60s, 70s, was actually a consultant on the original movie. Disclaimer, I've not seen any of them. It's not something that fascinates me enough to go watch a movie about it. But as she aptly points out, it's become a huge fascination for a lot of people, bringing back something that we've never seen, and realistically, we only have guesses at their image. She also points out that yes, it could go as drastically as animals that have been extinct rampaging across the earth, but dinosaurs are unrealistic. And I appreciated that she pointed out what was realistic and what wasn't, and explained why. For example, dinosaurs are pretty much impossible to ever bring back in any sort of capacity, because the main way in which they go about de-extincting a species is to take that species DNA that they have, and they don't have the complete DNA for it, because I mean, these species have been extinct for a while. They don't have the preservation techniques, even 100 years ago, that they do today. They can't cryogenically freeze it or whatever, which means that we don't have their complete DNA. Anyway, you take what DNA you have of the extinct species and you combine it with the closest recent relative that they have. So for example, when talking about the woolly mammoth, she said that if you wanted to bring it back, which is still a very questionable thing, you would take the DNA of an Asian elephant, which is its most recent closely related relative. I want to say it was something like 1.4 million genomes. Again, if I'm getting the scientific terms wrong, I'm sorry. There were a lot of them, so I may be confusing them. But 1.4 DNA somethings that I think are genomes of the woolly mammoth that we had and the Asian elephant that we have are the same, but that they diverged a long time ago because, you know, after the Ice Age we sort of melted everything. And by we, I just mean the Earth, not necessarily humans specifically at that time. But you take them and you merge them, so it's not necessarily bringing back the extinct animal like the woolly mammoth or the passenger pigeon or whatever else. It's more sort of creating a hybrid species that then looks more like the extinct species and theoretically acts more like the hybrid species. But that leads to some of the problems, because a woolly mammoth and an Asian elephant, they may look the same as far as size and the fact that they have tusks, but one of them has hair and small ears and their tusks curve up and it lives in very cold climates, and the other one has large ears, straighter tusks, and has no fur or hair, whatever you want to call it, because it lives in places like India, where it's kind of hot, unless you live up in the Himalayas, in which case it's cold, but you get my point. Besides that, there are behavioral issues. She talks in great depth about how you would go about getting a new extinct creature, an unextinct baby, and you would take the DNA of those two and you would put it into a surrogate mother. So in the case of woolly mammoths, you would put it into a surrogate female Asian elephant. But then once that baby is born, if it's born at all, because obviously elephants' blood and bodies reject strange things just like humans' bodies do to protect them. If that baby is born at all, we don't know what it would look like. We don't know how different it would be from the original woolly mammoth, because we obviously don't know what a woolly mammoth actually looks like as far as its DNA picture. And since we're combining it with current DNA, we don't know what that would look like, and we don't know the behaviors that the woolly mammoth had because nobody was writing it down at the time. And we don't know if the baby would be accepted by the Asian elephant's herd. We don't know what behaviors would be imprinted on it before it was even born, or what would be imprinted on it after it was born, and how that would change how it acted. I really enjoyed that aspect of her discussion, because she, not only does she discuss it with woolly mammoths, but she discusses it with passenger pigeons. And I think comparing almost the two of them, you know, with a massive elephant and a passenger pigeon, which isn't that big, was fascinating. She also talked about the risks of doing it with birds, specifically cloning bird DNA. There's something that I'm not entirely sure I understood weird with birds. If I remember correctly, it had something to do with the hatching process, and how as it goes through the bird, the egg, you have to get it at a specific point that's basically impossible to ascertain, and so cloning a bird is virtually impossible, which means that bringing back birds by cloning is, you know, virtually impossible. And bringing back clones of any sort of animal is also incredibly difficult, because there's the fact that you can't really grow a woolly mammoth in a petri dish, You know, you can't even grow a pigeon in a petri dish. But here we are. It was fascinating. So all of the sciencey bits aside, specifically about the woolly mammoth, which clearly I found fascinating, she does talk about cloning, she talks about IVF and all of that fun stuff. She also talks about this family in Siberia, the, oh god, Zimovs, Z-I-M-O-V. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, my Russian is non-existent. But she talks about them and how they live in the Pleistocene Park, which they started, and it is their attempt to bring back the ecosystem that the woolly mammoths lived in. So they have brought back a whole bunch of animals, and their theory and their hope is that if they can do this on a widespread scale, and I think she was talking about how they want to expand it to a lot more of Siberia than just their little corner, which, I mean, their little corner is by no means little, but for Siberia. And if they can expand it even more, then maybe they can slow down global warming. Obviously, since it seems like the entirety of Australia is on fire, and if we really need to do something about global warming, because it is a thing. The Earth is heating up, whether the seasons change or not, and I don't really want to die in a boiling ocean because that just seems like a horrible way to go. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. But she does talk about global warming and how they, the Zimovs, the Russian people, the father's name, the main proponent of Pleistocene Park, his name is Sergei. That much I did know. And his son is Nikita. But they theorize that back when the Earth was, you know, freezing and we had woolly mammoths, the herbivorous animals that lived up in the Pleistocene Park area in Siberia punched holes through the snow, which actually helped the light grasses that reflect light and don't absorb as much heat to keep the Earth cooler, so that all the carbon in the soil there from, you know, fossils and dead stuff didn't release into the air and cause extreme warming like we have now. And part of the reason they're doing this is that somewhere along the way, somebody out there saw all of this carbon-rich soil and went, oh crap, if this suddenly releases all of this carbon in the air, we're just gonna skyrocket the rate of global warming because there is so much carbon there. And methane, carbon and methane, which obviously is not great since they're both greenhouse gases. So that was also another fascinating aspect of this book, because it really goes into the science behind recreating these species or bringing them back in any sort of capacity. And as she points out multiple times, it's not going to be an exact recreation of these ancient species, because we can't do that. We don't have their DNA, we don't have the same climates or ecosystems that they had then. But then she goes into the ethics of it, which is also fascinating. Now, to start this segment, I guess, I will say she had about 3 or 4 pages on the legal ramifications of bringing back an extinct species. She does say that she focuses on European and North American law, which I appreciate. She looks briefly at other countries and their culture and what that would mean for them. For example, passenger pigeons went extinct in large part because they became this very fancy, fun, apparently good tasting thing to eat. And so people would pay a lot of money, and therefore hunters were out shooting them like Gaston every 2 days or more, and then stuffing them in barrels and sending them back, and so they went from flocks of billions to extinct in about 50 years. Not great, and somehow we stopped it with the buffalo, but apparently nobody cares about the pigeons. So that was also interesting, but as she says, there's not really any law out there on de-extinction because we haven't done it yet. The most we've done is cloning, and we only successfully cloned Dolly the sheep. She talks about that in depth as well, cloning in general and Dolly the sheep, and why cloning works sometimes, it doesn't work sometimes, and why it's difficult with birds and all of that. But there really is no law out there right now about de-extinction. She does mention that it might be patentable in the States, because it would be novel, but since we haven't had that question yet, there's no precedent, there's no statute about any of it. She also goes into whether or not they would qualify as endangered species under the Endangered Species Act, which could seriously affect whether we would bring them back just to be extinct again. Which leads me into the ethics. I think this was the most fascinating part for me, because she mentions, when she really gets into the meat and bones of the ethics portion, that humans have this fascination and fear of playing God, Frankenstein being the most famous example of playing God. And if we can bring creatures back by essentially creating new hybrids that act more like their old counterparts, are we playing God? Should we be doing that? And what are the ramifications for morals? And I think she had a really interesting point when she was talking to one of her sources in the book. There's a lot of sources and scientists. She talks to a lawyer at one point, so you'd have to read the book, because I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but he said that he went to Peru to help save one of the animals down there. And when he was there, he asked the other people that he was with, well, why should we try to save these animals? And everybody just kind of gave him this horrified, dumbfounded look, like, why could you even ask such a stupid question? How is that possible? And he realized that saving animals, or corals, which I mean I guess are animals, but ecosystems, that's the word, is something that we just feel is right, but there's no real rationale for it that you can explain. It's not something that you can say, oh, well, I think we should save them because X, Y, Z. It's more of a, I feel like I should save them. And so she looks at that and the emotional aspect of why we would want to bring back some of these animals, because of the nostalgia of it. Oh yeah, I want to bring back the tigers because I want a pet tiger, you know? And all of that kind of stuff, which, fun fact, strict liability, which she also mentions in this, wild animals. If you own a wild animal, you are strictly liable for all damage they do, which is terrifying. But she talks about that as well in the book, and how that could change people's perception, especially if we're bringing them back for nostalgic reasons. You have to be aware that if you want to keep a woolly mammoth in your yard, you would be strictly liable for everything after that. If they get loose and rampage and accidentally trample the next door neighbor's dog, well, you gotta pay for a new dog, kind of a thing. So that was interesting. But the depth at which she looks at the ethics and doesn't seem to really pick a side. She looks at the God complex versus don't do that. And I think she does a good job of balancing them without picking one or the other, which I greatly appreciate, because it is hard to do that. Beyond that, I'm not really going to go into the ethics too deeply. One, because I don't want this video to end up being 40 minutes long, and two, because it's hard to explain if you haven't read the book. So all of that said, if you are at all interested in this book, if you're interested in science or extinct animals, or even just the title fascinates you, because Necrofauna is rather eye-catching, I highly recommend this book. I am absolutely going to explicitly recommend this to my friend Chelsea, because I think she would find this absolutely fascinating. But if you want to talk about anything I've said, or talk about the book, before, after you've read it, whatever, let me know down in the comments below. I would love to chat. And I think that's it. So I will see you all in my next video. Bye.